What was that you heard about on the Freakonomics podcast?
Several podcasts over a series about what you should do with your money and really stupid things you can do with your money. And the big takeaway is you shouldn't be giving your money to professional investors to pick and choose stocks. And they had all the numbers, and it's like the best investment you can do, other than giving it to someone like Warren Buffett, who's one of the few investors who beats the market consistently. Just put it in an index fund and leave it there.
Well, index funds scare me with regard to corporate governance. Let's say you got a guy, he's head of a corporation, and the corporation is big enough that it's in the index fund. Suppose he does crappy. Suppose he says, to heck with it, I'm going to do crappy deliberately, and I'm going to get all my buddies on the board, and they're going to pay me a whole lot of money. Who is going to vote against this SOB if all the shareholders are index fund guys who own everything, and this is just a tiny percentage of their portfolio? Who's going to care? Who's going to hold this guy accountable? Now, right now we have a mixture, and you also have activists who will, if a corporation is being poorly run, they will do a hostile takeover or try to get themselves on the board and stuff like that.
He talked about that a bit, and that what you're saying. If everybody did was index funds, then you don't have these people caring about how these individual companies are performing in terms of stockholders and investors.
Right. Well, once they get in the index, their stock is going to be purchased. I advocate real estate investment and your own home, and I've written a lot about silver and gold. Not that I like either one of them, but I have some because my wife insists, and I'm familiar with the advantages and disadvantages and all that. But there's no single easy answer to investing like index funds. They have generally done well. I would say, I don't think they existed in the Great Depression, but if they had, they would have been crap. The whole market dropped 80-90%. Similar thing happened to real estate. So you need to have stuff in a lot of categories.
Yeah, it seems like the idea of the index fund is diversification. So you're saying you should be more diversified.
Well, but also you're not paying the fees associated with having a stock manager who's going to pay you a ton of money, who's going to charge you a ton of money for his brilliant insight.
You put it in the index fund and forget about it.
It's cheap. Well, and they did the numbers. Something like 2% of these professional stock guys cover their costs.
Right, and it's a different 2% every year because there's just luck. But the index fund is cheaper because the management fee is really low, because the management, it just involves keeping the index fund matched up to the index in terms of the size of each stock in the index. And then they also don't do transactions. If you do transactions, you trigger capital gains taxes. So that takes away part of your money and depresses your yield. So they avoid transactions. They avoid paying somebody to analyze. They don't analyze anything. They just, if this stock is 2% of the Dow Jones, they make sure their fund is 2% that stock. So, but it's basically what happened was somebody compared what your yield would have been if you just bought the whole Dow Jones Industrial Average or the whole S&P 500 and held it for 20 years compared to if you were in the famous funds. And you almost always did better because you didn't have transaction costs and you had very little management costs. And so somebody just discovered that the fund managers are churning the money and paying themselves fees, and it's taken away from your yield. You might be better off instead of with an index fund, just creating your own index fund and buying a bunch of stuff, like buy the Dow Jones stocks individually, and buy them straight from the company and stuff like that, where you can save a little money, and then just hold it. Over time, the Dow Jones would change and your portfolio wouldn't. But so what?
What about REITs and?
Well, I used to be against
other comparable.
I used to be against REITs, and now I'm kind of in favor of them.
What is an REIT?
Real Estate Investment Trust. They own, like you might see an apartment building, and it's owned by an REIT, and the apartment building, the trust would own maybe apartment buildings in 37 states or something. So it's diversity, and you don't, if you own the apartment building yourself, you're going to get sued and have to go to court and give depositions, and You're going to have tenants that don't pay the rent and all that. That'll happen in your apartment building in the REIT, but you won't know about. You won't be lying awake at night worrying about it. So it's they have become very professional, very big, very institutionalized, and they've done very well recently. And in some markets, they don't always do well, but they've done very well. They pay dividends. They're required by law to pay 90% of their profit out in dividends. So they have a tendency to be provide you with a decent income, much higher than you would get on a bond.
So the Google engineer that got fired for he called it the ideological echo chamber. Other people are calling it the manifesto.
Which is just an effort to... It's like adding agent in front of orange to make it sound
right,
sinister.
Right. Using the suffix con.
Or using orange
to
instead of blue
people.
to make it sinister.
But you started to read this 10-pager and you couldn't finish it. It was too hard to read.
Who wrote this?
James Damore.
James Damore is a Google guy who got fired for writing this thing. The basic idea is he said that maybe the reason there aren't 50-50 women in high-tech jobs and in management is because they're not interested, they're not suited for it. That's because females are different. And
as a statistical group. And he explicitly says in there that he's not talking about every single individual.
Right.
And he spends every sentence kind of qualifying that every time. It should be done once, and we can do it once. Obviously, there are exceptions to all this. But the statistics are what they are. I don't know if he cited it, but one of the statistics is, you look at men and women, how many hours they work. Men work more.
Yeah.
That's not good or bad. It just is.
And it has the effect.
But if you look at my own household, my wife works more than 40 hours, and I work less than 40 hours, and have for years.
Yeah.
So it's not a reflection on everybody, but the statistical group known as women work less than the statistical group known as men, and we shouldn't pretend that's not the case.
And they take at age 45, they might have fewer years of experience because they took time off to raise kids and all that.
So have kids at the very least.
Yeah.
An existential problem for the species.
Yeah.
Well, and ardent men just in general, they tend to be more aggressive. They tend to be more...
that's all covered in a lot.
More competitive, more...
Even Hillary admitted that there was a study that men negotiate harder than women. Women are less likely to kind of push the envelope on that. So
men are more...
It's a personality trait.
Women are more risk averse than men, typically.
Yes. Men choose to do more dangerous jobs. They choose to do more overtime. Not all of them, obviously, like we said at the beginning, but as a statistical group, these are the facts. And the guy at Google, basically, his argument was, there's all these studies that unequivocally show that these two groups are not the same, so to expect them to be represented 50% is ridiculous. And furthermore, having programs at Google to train females on these particular areas at Google that need more women, according to the diversity police.
Yeah, remedial computer programming for females.
Yeah, it may not be productive, and it's discriminatory by definition. These classes are not available to the men, and they are available to the women, according to him.
And they're free, right?
I don't know what the...
Yeah, I think
they're not...
Okay.
Yeah.
They're allowed to... One group is allowed to do them, another group is not allowed to do it because of gender.
This kind of stuff came up back when my alma mater, West Point, went co-ed along with the Naval Academy and the Air Force Academy. In 1976, they started admitting women. And I said, look, the reason they admitted women, the reason they admitted me and my male classmates in 64, when it was not co-ed, is because they wanted to defend the nation. That's what West Point is for. It produces Army officers. Air Force Academy produces Air Force officers. Naval Academy produces naval officers. So they were selecting me based on how well they thought I could defend the country. Putting women in there in 1976 was not then done to make it the defense of the country better. It was done to placate Gloria Steinem and that crowd. It was done for the wrong reasons, and it had kind of a attitude that West Point is a scholarship program, and females should not be denied a taxpayer-funded scholarship program. Now, Does that mean if they made they made the decision to put women at West Point, does that mean it was a bad decision? Not necessarily. Maybe not. I've met women. I like them. I'm proud that they're graduates of my school. But I think they were put there for the wrong reason. And I think what you would need to find out if it was a good idea is a study. It would say, how have they done? And there's not going to be such a study because you're not allowed to study such a thing, because studying it would suggest that maybe the leftist politically correct narrative is incorrect. Now, they don't have 50-50 women at West Point. They have 6 guys for every girl. But and I don't think, when Princeton went co-ed, they got a zillion fabulous women applying for the slots. When West Point went co-ed, I don't think there was a big backlog of women wanting to go to West Point.
Right. But isn't that society's fault?
Well, they need to do a study and see how they're doing and whether or not it made the defense of the nation better. And now they're going with the whole LGBTZQ thing, and they
I feel like a few of those letters were
AA2S.
Yeah, they're PMS, and they're acting like that the goal of the U.S. Military Academy is diversity. The goal is to defend the nation, and then their response would be, well, diversity makes us stronger. Well, you put a few women and gays on a football team. I don't know how they're going to do in the competition for the NFL championship. So anyway, what I would like to see is a neural network program handle all this, where you put in all the data, and the neural network program, which will not have a red neck. It can make sure they'll examine all the parts when it's assembled. There will be no red neck. It will just look for correlations.
Skynet from the South?
It will look for correlations between variables
young people
and performance.
Right.
And if it sees it, I was thinking of this in terms of who gets to come to the United States. If it sees a correlation, common sense, it won't let that person in. And maybe it'll turn out to be that left-handed people from southeastern Pakistan tend to be terrorists. And if that's what it is, that's what it is. But the computer doesn't care.
What year did West Point go co-ed?
76. They entered. So the first graduating class was 80.
I guess about 40 years later, maybe slightly less, is when it started they wanted to get a female ranger as well. That was about a year or two ago, right?
Yeah, one of the first 3 female rangers is the daughter of a West Point classmate of mine who was in my ranger class.
Okay.
And I don't know what happened there. Some insider needs to write the story of that. But it
sounded like they basically decided this is going to happen.
Well, they went the 2 who got it the first time. I think it was like their 3rd try. And when I went to ranger school, you got one shot and you're done. And they let these women go through it 3 times. Well, hell. High school dropouts could be doctors if they could go to medical school 16 times. That seems a little squirrely, and they swear on a stack of Bibles that they met the same standards. But I don't get it. You don't get higher pay for being a ranger.
West Point and the ranger school and the military in general, it's a lot of physical work, and the tests should be physical in nature, and it seems like they change the standards. They do it for firefighters and police too, I believe.
Well, they were initially, when they wanted to make women firefighters, the male firefighters made the test like biased against the female body, and the court they were taken to court, and the court said you can have a physical test, but the physical test has to be of what you do on the job.
Right.
So now to be a fire person, you have to grab a hose and run with it for 50 meters or something, and you have to climb ladders carrying stuff, and you got to carry people over your back that you're saving. They have tests that are realistic, and I think that makes sense. And they have female firefighters. So I think if the standards match the job, you're okay.
Yeah, insofar as the test is checking to see if you can complete the task, then whoever gets in gets in.
Right.
But if the task is to carry your 220-pound fellow soldier,
compatriot,
50 yards, you better be able to do that.
Yeah.
And,
well, you're talking about life or death when that happens. That's right. A wounded guy.
Well, yeah, and I mean, it seems that people are sort of grudgingly willing to accept, societally, that men do better in sports. So I don't understand why it's so hard to accept this in other arenas. This seems to be this politically correct.
Well, it's the refusal to admit that men and women might be different in the aggregate, which is readily
and we're talking about physically. I mean, mentally, they actually do better in school and they graduate higher and all that. But physically,
it's for the most part acknowledged in the physical realm.
For the most part,
at the fact that they have an OBGYN. There's men's basketball and women's basketball are separate sports. They don't just have basketball, and these are accepted as normal things, but for some reason they want pure and absolute total equality in things like nursing schools, which doesn't make any sense.
Some famous male tennis player recently said
John McEnroe. I was about to bring that up.
Yeah, Vanessa Williams or Venus?
No,
Venus?
Serena
Williams. That she broke some record for major championships. The
greatest. He called her the greatest women's tennis player ever. And the interviewer was, wait a minute, why are you qualifying it?
And he said if she was in the male side,
in the men's bracket,
she'd rank like 700th in the world.
Yeah,
and I think that's true. There's some goofy thing that where if a woman puts her head against a woman or man, they lean their head against a wall in a certain position, the woman can stand up, but the man can't. You ever seen that?
Yeah, I've seen it.
Well, that's an obvious. It's
not
because the wall is a redneck.
Has to do with where the center of gravity is.
Yeah.
Misogynist wall bastard.
Yeah. It's not a redneck misogynist wall. It's just a
misandrist wall, actually.
It's a law of physics issue.
Wall.
But this guy, now I want to talk about young people here. I'm 71 years old, and I know people in their 20s.
We're back to the Google engineer.
Yeah, the Google engineer. He was 28.
28, James Damore.
Yeah, I'm 71 years old. I was 28. I was 21, 22. I did the whole 20s thing, all 9 of them, or 10. Yeah. All 10 of them. And people that age, they think people my age, we're old and we're dying. And that's true. But we're not stupid. And this thing, this is like, 10 pages? It's like 7 or 8 pages of, I'm not biased, I'm not a bigot, I'm politically correct, just like you. And before he finally gets to his freaking point. It's all this goofy stuff about he's not against diversity, and he's not against psychological safety zones. Yo, shut up! What you're not against, and tell us what you want to say.
Almost every sentence has a but in it. The first sentence of his background. People generally have good intentions, but we all have biases which are invisible to us. Really?
Bull. I'm 71. I don't have to talk like that.
We agree with this guy's ultimate point, by the way. It's the tiptoeing around his point and falling over himself to qualify it on every paragraph and every sentence.
Yeah,
which basically amounts to apologizing for his point.
Yeah.
Well, he wants to make
8 pages out of 10.
He wants to make sure he has memorized the Catechism of Political Correctness, and he does not deviate from it. But he just. Excuse me, but could I please make this little point that might sound like it deviates from the catechism? Don't hurt me. This reminds me of the recording that we got. Osama bin Laden was sitting around with his buds over in Tora Bora or wherever the heck he was. And they were talking about, he's a civil engineer. They're talking about how the
Did you know that?
I
didn't know that.
The World Trade Towers.
The more you know.
He's talking about how the World Trade Towers collapsed and what the basic fundamentals of the structure of the steel and all that stuff, and the fire and the concrete protection on the steel. Anyway, we get this recording, and I saw an English translation of it. And apparently, if you're one of those guys, a jihadi Muslim terrorist, apparently the rule is you can't say 8 words without stopping and sucking up to Allah. So it's like, hey, good morning, God willing. How you doing? God is great. I'm fine, and Muhammad is his prophet. That's the way they talk. Like every sentence, they get some stop, suck up to Allah, and then they go on. And this
technical documents must be just...
Yeah.
And then Eli threw a touchdown to Odell. Praise be Allah.
Yeah. And then this guy from Google... He's the same way, only he doesn't say Allah. It's safety zones and trigger warnings and all this garbage.
I value diversity and inclusion.
There you go.
I'm not denying that sexism exists.
Yeah, and the God of PC willing.
And don't endorse using stereotypes.
And save the whales.
the gay whales.
Psychological safety is built on mutual respect and acceptance.
Oh my
What
God.
is this? This is all boilerplate.
Oh, it
This
hurts
is-
my soul.
His point is way down. Pages later, he gets to his point after he bows and scrapes to the gods of PC over and over and over. And the people in their 20s, I guess there are some exceptions, but maybe the ones that went to college, this is the way they behave.
Like,
This
is
is the
this
way
like-
they talk. They're
It's like
nuts.
a prerequisite. Like if by the end of this beginning rant about praying to the PC gods, if I am satisfied, I will continue reading. If not, I will take my eyes.
Well, and the
elsewhere.
funny part is those people are going to read through this, and as soon as they get to the part they don't like, that's when they're done. So he has to delay that point. But most of the pundits are just skipping straight to the bad stuff.
Well, here's a subhead in his article: possible non-biased causes of the gender gap in tech. Whoa, that's a whole 8-9 words without sucking up to the gods of PC. That's where they stop reading. That's why he's been fired and pilloried, because he said possibly some of the causes of the lower percentage of women in tech than in the population in general might be caused by something other than bias. Yeah, no kidding. But that's where he got fired. But he tried and tried and tried for pages. Oh, don't think that I'm a pro-stereotype. Don't think I'm anti-women. On and on and on about all these. It reminds me back in the McCarthy era, which is sort of before my time. I was a little kid. But they would go into a corporation and make everybody there sign loyalty oaths to say they were patriotic. What they should have said is, I'm not signing a loyalty oath unless you got probable cause to believe that I'm not a loyal citizen. You don't come in here and make me sign that for no reason. Get out of here. But everybody signed it. They were cowed by it. And this sounds like the same thing. Like you've got to prove your political correctness at length before they'll consider letting you discuss anything that the political correct people don't like. And in this case, as soon as he got to that point, he's fired. By Google, one of the biggest companies, is trying to please as many people as possible, but they don't care about all the people who think political correctness is wrong.
Right.
So the whole generation of the people in their 20s, and you guys are in your 30s, I guess maybe it's the college-educated ones. They have been screwed up. They need to be deprogrammed. It's like they joined the Hare Krishnas or something. These guys are goofy. They can't talk.
The what now?
Hare Krishna, a cult.
Why didn't you just say that?
I thought maybe everybody had somebody.
I've heard of it.
Some guy with a shaved head and an orange robe try to stick a flower in their lapel with a safety pin. I told the guy to go F himself, but they're like you can't have
And
a
he
normal.
responded with "Peace be with you."
No, he just had this beatific. My brain is off, and my screensaver is me smiling.
Shake the mouse.
But anyway, this is what I think the topic of discussion on this Google guy getting fired is not this possible non-biased causes of differing gender success in tech. It's the fact that he bows and scrapes for pages and pages. He cannot get through a sentence or a paragraph without bowing to the gods of political correctness. And this is like funny. Like a couple decades from now, people are going to look back at this and laugh. Like they look back and laugh at disco. This is goofy. Or building fallout shelters in your backyard in the 50s. This is going to be an embarrassment to this generation, just like our long hair back in the 70s is an embarrassment to my baby boomer generation.
I certainly hope so. But yeah, he takes about 2-3 pages to get to the meat of it. There's a great graph that shows two bell curves of two populations. One is farther to the right than the other one, but
they're offset.
They overlap.
For the most part, they're the same. There's a little bit of overlap.
And you can see the graphic below it shows just the median or sort of the peak of it. And what it's basically pointing out is that people usually talk about these statistical distributions in terms of those two lines instead of the two curves. And
they're bell curves.
Well, it's saying
it portrays a very different reality. Reducing people to their group identity and assuming the average is representative ignores the overlap of the two bell curves.
It's the gender wage gap. Women get paid 76 cents on the dollar. Well, it's not like all the men are getting $100 and all the women are getting $76. No, some of the men are getting $76 and some of the women are getting $100. But on average,
it's also that the average female makes 104 cents and the average male makes 98 cents. When you adjust for number of years on the job, taking into account women leaving the workforce.
We can get into the whole gender wage gap thing if you want. We sort of talked about the point.
Well, we'll dabble in it.
Well, men and women ask for different things. They negotiate for different things, and people have done the studies
as a group.
As a group, where when you work out and you pull out, women tend to have more flexible schedules. That's a little bit off your pay. They ask for more days off.
To be more specific, Thomas Sowell, and others have looked at never married women who work into their 30s and 40s, and they make more than men of the same description.
Right.
And it basically the difference in the entire group of women and the entire group of men is that there are more women. There are less women that fit that description of never married that work through
than men,
and various other categories, however you want to describe them. That all these decisions affect their pay. It's not discrimination at the place of work. If anything, that data proves that the men are being discriminated against. But I'm sure there's other factors involved.
I go back to the neural network programming. I'll give you an example how this came to my consciousness. Once upon a time, the police discovered that people would steal credit cards. They would go buy $1 worth of gas. And so they put out a bulletin.
To test if it worked?
To see if it had been canceled yet. So they put out a bulletin on that. And one of the people who received it was Mellon Bank in Pittsburgh. Well, Mellon Bank had a neural network program that was constantly watching all credit card transactions. And many months before, the Mellon Bank program spotted that correlation, that buying you would see, from the computer's perspective, it would see a $1 gas station transaction come through, and then hours or a day later, it would see a cancellation of the card come through with a report that it was stolen. So they immediately started, Mellon Bank would immediately started suspending the credit card as soon as that $1 gas transaction came in. And the cops were later telling them, but the cops weren't using neural networks. A neural network is like a child. You tell it, this is good, this is bad, here's all the data in the world. And it sees correlations between what is good and what is bad. So the neural networking programming is like a judge that has no bias. It has no bias. You just give it all the data and you say, find the variables that correlate and find the variables that are associated with the good stuff and the bad stuff. So it could look at all these questions about women in tech and women in nursing and all that, and women in service academies, and it would look at all the data. It would look at all the data. It wouldn't cherry pick data for advocacy of one side or the other. It would look at all the data and say, all right, we're dumping all this data because there's no correlation, and now we're left with this batch of data which has correlations, and there appears to be this correlation, and these correlations, and that's the science. If you want a bunch of politically correct priests and priestesses who have a catechism that everybody's supposed to memorize and recite, then they're exposed for what they are, because the neural network programming is saying these are real differences in behavior in the groups being compared, and I have no bias as a computer.
Yeah, you hire someone to do a study for you. There's a tendency for those people to be biased towards the people who are paying them.
Well, yeah, but also they're honest people. I once wanted to do lease options were hot in the real estate investment world, so I decided, well, I'll cash in on this. I'll write the John Reed book on how to do lease options, and I went and investigated them, and they're fundamentally, they don't work unless you do it in an immoral way. So I wrote my book and I said that. Well, it didn't help sales to say that. People don't want to hear that. And at least what lease options are is a way of bamboozling tenants into paying more rent than normal, and they think they're going to get the house as a result. But the way they're structured, they almost never get the house. They just pay more rent. They just took advantage of their lack of understanding of what an option is. Options Somebody, a stock brokerage guy, used to have me on his radio show a lot. He said in the stock market, 90% of the fights between a client and a customer, a client and a stockbroker, they go to arbitration. 90% of them are about options, and 90% of those, the argument of the client is it was unsuitable for me, and what that means is I was not sophisticated enough to understand this, therefore it shouldn't have been sold to me, which is a rule. It's called the know your customer rule. But anyway, 90% of the problems were options, of all the fights between customers and brokers, and 90% of those were about you shouldn't have sold me this because I'm too unsophisticated. The people who are being victims of the lease option are unsuitable for such an investment because they're not smart enough. They think they understand it when it's explained to them, but they don't. When they lose money, then they understand it. But anyway, that was a case of where it was in my interest to find that lease options were great so that I could write about how great they were and cash in on this big trend. But I was honest, and I said, well, sorry, but this is not a good idea, and here's why. So there are honest researchers, but the fact that you're being paid by one side doesn't mean the study's wrong.
Not necessarily.
But it is probably
if
should
it's
be
government
noted.
funded, I think there's a high proclivity for the political motives.
The government is biased. Yeah.
Because
look what we just had. What was in Seattle? They jacked their minimum wage way up, like $12, $13. They
might be 15.
They 12 or 13.
They're working
jacked
towards
it up by.
No, up to.
I think.
But then they hired. Yeah, they hired. This is Seattle, Washington. They hired the University of Washington economists to evaluate whether or not it hurt jobs. And as they were working on it, they were giving preliminary reports of their study. The answer was hell yes. So the same guys that hired them, the mayor of Seattle, I think, went to the University of California at Berkeley, in the People's Republic of Berkeley, and got some commie economists there to do a study. Say, oh no, it didn't hurt jobs. And I think maybe they're even suing the University of Washington, their own guys. But this is obvious government bias. They don't want to hear. They wanted the university's imprimatur and the university's good housekeeping seal of approval based on science, and these are educated, honest men. And when the educated, honest science wasn't coming in the way they wanted, they immediately went running to
this is
Berkeley.
This is a problem in the corporate world as well. Companies paying for research,
like the cigarette industry.
Well, but they're not really paying for the research. They're paying for they're paying for the result. I need research showing.
Well, don't call them companies.
Will extend your life.
Don't call them companies because that means all. The companies that have a great product will pay for research that shows it's a great product. Companies that have a crap product will pay for dishonest research that shows that's a crap product. So the companies that have a great product don't need to get a biased study. They need an unbiased study.
Well, but they can get research studies to say, this isn't actually, our product doesn't contribute to obesity, therefore don't tax the hell out of us.
Yeah, but a particular company doesn't have the same power to get all the studies they need.
Well, there's certainly a difference between a government organization, in which
the funding,
a lot of them have a blank check.
The difference in
our money.
The difference in funding is enormous. So,
but a good company will want a study to prove the products are good. Bad companies also want dishonest studies, and that's life. But you can't write off all studies because of who paid for it, and you can't say that all companies are dishonest.
I would never make such a generalization.
You're blowing the catechism of free markets here.
So he goes, the Google engineer writing the manifesto, so to speak, goes for a few pages. It's pretty straightforward. He's not falling over himself as much, talking about studies that show women are more interested in this versus men, more cooperative. But then he says they're more prone to anxiety, and then says something about average look for more work-life balance, which I as the statistic I cited earlier. If you look at all men and all women work less hours.
Yeah.
Which, and if the two things are work and life, they want more life, less work.
Compared to men.
Yeah, and frankly, I agree with them. I am in there. I want more life, less work.
Well, more
Me
flexible
too.
hours, more vacation days. More...
A lot of men
Well,
don't feel that way. They feel, for whatever reason, doesn't matter, but they will work long hours. I had a lot of classmates worked 80-plus hours a week for half a decade or more.
It's entirely personal preference. It just so happens that when you take men and women in the aggregate, women's personal preferences tend to lean towards life, and men's lean less towards it and more towards more hours and more salary and more overtime and all that.
When you guys were babies, I was your Mr. Mom father. I gave you more bottles than she did. I gave you more spoon feeding. I changed more diapers than she did. But I wanted to work at home, and it didn't make sense to hire somebody when I was there, and it worked. And I know a zillion guys who my age who regret they didn't spend more time with their kids. I could not have spent more time with you guys, and I think it was a good decision. It also would, on the bell chart, it would make me look like a female. Mr. Mom is the name for it.
Right. Well, those two bell curves, you're farther on the left than most men, and maybe more average with a lot of the women. And it's similar for me. I've been working from home for the entirety of my kids.
I'm also a West Point
existence.
graduate, airborne ranger, Vietnam veteran. I volunteered for all that stuff. That would put me on the other end.
Right.
So I'm like the 5 blind guys describing the elephant.
You should check for bipolar disorder.
No,
Yeah.
check for non-stereotype behavior.
Right.
I do what I want, and sometimes it looks like the more female approach, and sometimes it looks like the more male approach. But we're all unique individuals.
Well, I think that's part of the objection of the PC culture, is even referring to that as what the males do and what the females do. They think that sort of language is constricting on the victims of society.
They ought to chill and let people do what they want, and make sure there are no impediments. One of the problems is they used to be,
Jack Reed tells them to chillax.
You would go into when I was stationed in the South in the Army, you go into a laundromat and it would say whites only. And they weren't talking about the clothes. They're talking about the color of the people who are allowed to go there. Because the white people didn't want to put their clothes in the same washer dryer that a black person had used. That was stupid, and I don't know that it should have been outlawed. I think it would have gone away on its own as just being obviously stupid. But the thing now
if someone
is they're looking with a microscope to try to find the most subtle racism.
They're looking for it. If
it's not there.
You're going to find it.
It's not there, but they're claiming basically the left had great fun in the civil rights era. They were the good guys and they were the heroes, and everybody else were the bums, and they love that, and they want to reprise that. It's their greatest hits. The left's greatest hit was the civil rights era, so they want to do it again. But hey, guys, you won. It's over. It's Shelby Steele. The race thing is over. We won. Yay! Now we go on to other things. They don't want to go on to other things. They want to prolong it. So now they get a microscope, and they
I saw a quote.
They complain about stuff that happened 150 years ago.
They have a supply and demand problem. There's a high demand for bigotry and a low supply.
Yeah.
High demand for Nazis.
So they're going to find them.
And not enough Nazis running around. So the
we
language.
call Trump
So
a
now we're
Nazi.
talking about microaggressions.
Yeah, and psychological safety zones,
undertones.
Yeah, and triggers.
Yeah, all these terms that just strike me as we have no evidence that this stuff's happening, but we're gonna find it.
And if we don't keep bashing tiny little instances that you might be able to call racism, if we don't keep doing that with utter vigilance, one day it'll just explode again, and we'll be in the middle of Jim Crow.
Well, that's one of their arguments that we really have to stand vigilant. And my attitude as one of these silly millennials, I think I'm one of the elderly millennials, is we grew up in a different world than the generation before us. They saw a lot of this discrimination, including after the Civil Rights Act. Tiger Woods was still catching shit in the 90s, a little bit, from guys on TV. But people like him have just destroyed that entire world that people lived in. And a lot of people still think they're still pretending. They're like the Civil War reenactors.
Yeah.
But it's the civil rights reenactors putting on their old clothes and marching with their arms and hoping that a fire hose hits them.
I wish to explain that my son, who just described himself as an elderly millennial, is 36. That's Dan.
That makes me one of the old ones.
Yeah, people tell me I'm a millennial. I'm like, I do not associate with those people in any form or fashion. My college, when I was there, did not have safe spaces. There was no such thing. Nobody had heard of it. Yeah. Nobody knew. No, I had never heard of a trigger warning.
No, there were no safe spaces.
Well, Dan went to Columbia.
Well, there was definitely PC culture. We had Andy Dick is a comedian, and he was doing a show there. We had a show every spring, and he was let off by this at the time unknown female comedian named Lisa Lampanelli, who is now known as the Queen of Mean, and she's done a bunch of the Comedy Central roasts. And some student services guy comes out and reads a card really dryly. She's known as the Queen of Mean. This boilerplate description of her. They should have done with a little more animation. And he was of Middle Eastern descent. He was an American, but so she comes out, grabs the microphone from him after the introduction. Everybody claps. And she says, "Give it up for the immigrant." And the applause kind of lowered a little bit. There were a few nervous laughs. And I don't remember my thought process at the time, but I couldn't believe she said it. And she went on to do this entire set of, all the black men she'd been with and just crossing every line there is in PC culture.
Oh, and this was in what year?
This is 2003.
Yeah.
So this is before safe spaces and triggers and all that. But I can tell you the amount of applause decreased throughout the show. And I remember walking home afterwards, just hearing people, verbally clutching their pearls. And this is at Columbia in 2003.
Did they have the vapors?
From what I read, it is far worse now. They had a Black Lives Matter protest there. And they all laid down on the ground to symbolize,
Hands up, don't shoot.
What will happen to all of them at some point in their life if you don't look at statistics.
You talking about
and they said
whites and blacks?
They said no whites.
Oh, no whites were allowed.
They said, you guys go stand over there.
This is what progress looks like.
Colors only.
We appreciate your support, but you don't get to lay down.
Telling the whites to go stand off to the side is what progress looks like.
It's getting worse and worse.
When it's all the way around, it's when they have to go to the back instead of the side.
Yeah.
So anyway, I want to make one other point here, just to be provocative about this Jim Crow. I was a kid.
Oh, this will be fun.
I was a kid in the 50s.
John T. Reed supports Jim Crow.
I was a kid in the 50s, and I grew up in a former slave state for those years. Anyway, Delaware. Delaware was in the Union, but it was a slave state. I think there were 4 slave states in the Union. Anyway, when I was at that school, they had the 1954 U.S. Supreme Court decision that said you couldn't have separate but equal schools; they had to be the same. So they started.
Separate is inherently unequal.
Well, they started saying that blacks could go to any school they wanted. And in the town where I lived, a small town, small farm community, less than 2,000 people, they had white school where I went. And when we arrived at town, my mom went to the school board and said, I'm new in town, I need to sign up my kids. And they put them in a white school. She didn't ask for the white school, they just put them in a white school. They had a black elementary school, and then the black high school kids had to go in a bus to Dover, which was like 32 miles round trip every day, because that's where the black high school was. So, and then when they started to integrate, this town said, well, we're going to integrate starting with the first grade. So we'll allow blacks into first grade. And the basic idea was, no, you're not doing that. You let them into every grade. But that's what they did anyway. And but let me tell you, the blacks almost all lived on the west side of the little town. And you would never, ever be afraid to go there any time of day, ever. It was the whole town was pretty safe, but that was even safer. And it was all moms and dads and kids, and they went to school and they worked hard. And I think they were told you have to work twice as hard as a white man, just like women used to be told you have to work twice as hard as a man. And they worked twice as hard, most of them, and they did okay. I get to West Point, and I saw a roster one day of all the guys. I was a freshman. I saw a roster of all the guys in my class, and I had their hometown. And there was this one guy in his hometown, was this little town I'm talking about. And it's so small that I'm thinking, how could I not know this guy? And I figured, well, maybe after I moved away, sophomore year of high school, his family moved in. So one day we were wearing a uniform and we had name tags. Some of the uniforms at West Point have name tags. And I saw the guy's name. And I said, are you from so-and-so? He said, yeah. How'd you know that? I said, well, I'm from there too. And I saw your hometown on the roster. I said, how come you and I don't? I said, did you move there after I did? He said, no, I was born there. My family's been there for 1,000,000 years. Meaning they were slaves in the pre-Civil War. As descendants of slaves. And the white kids that I went to school with were the descendants of the slave owners of those kids. So anyway, this guy's my West Point classmate. And we became kind of friendly because we had this little town. But I said, well, if you lived there your whole life, how could I not know you? It's a small town. He said, because I'm a Negro. This was 1964 when that was the term. Even when I graduated in 1968, the New York Times would use the word Negro on the front page. You can see it in the yearbook where they put the headlines of the day. He said, I'm a Negro. You're a white guy. I had to go to the Negro school up in, up north. And so I said, oh, yes, I have a vague recollection of people saying there was such a thing. But anyway, Thomas Sowell's big on this, and Dan knows those statistics better. The blacks did better in certain categories: employment rate, unemployment rate, out-of-wedlock birth rate, single-parent families. All those categories, the blacks did better during the Jim Crow era. Now, it wasn't... That's a misleading statement because it wasn't the Jim Crow era that made them do better in those categories.
Hot take. John T. Reed says blacks were better off in the Jim Crow era.
Well, they were better off because it was the pre-Black Power era and the pre-affirmative action era. It was the...
Well, and if you thought of yourself as a victim, you failed.
Well, the kids were not taught to think of themselves as a victim at all. They were told you have to work twice as hard as a white man. They were also told behave yourself because you don't want to get into the justice system as a black guy where all the people running it are white guys.
As if white people don't tell their kids to behave themselves. This is not some outlandish race thing. It's you tell your kids to behave themselves.
My sense, there was a playground in that town. It was a privately owned playground, and the guy who it was his property, it was a neat playground. There was like a canal in it, and he had little boats you could get on, and you could push in a pole, and he had these swinging ropes and stuff. It was more advanced and more dangerous,
and more dangerous,
and more fun.
Get away with that. But of course, it was more fun.
But it was integrated. And not that nobody made a fuss about it, but the black kids were there, and so were we. And that was the only time we would play with them, and we would be hanging around with them all day at this playground. And so I had a sense of their community. And I remember one day there was one guy who was really funny, and he had all the kids around him, black and white kids, and he was doing it like a comedy routine. And he had us laughing our butts off. And there was this other black kid who kept saying, don't draw attention to colored people, to him, kind of quietly. Stop drawing attention to colored people. So I think they were explicitly told, you need to keep, not only do you have to work twice as hard as a white man to succeed, you got to be twice as well behaved. Quiet. Yeah, it was called the Quiet Village, informally, that part of town, called the Quiet Village. But I think they were told to work very hard at not drawing attention. And I remember it was Sammy Davis Jr. around the time I was in college. He married, he's a black entertainer, married a white Swedish woman. And that was rare back then. And some young black kid who was one of his fans was talking to him once, and he said, "You're too strong, man. You know, you pushing the envelope too hard." But now I don't think they should have to be quiet, and I don't think they should have to work twice as hard as a white man. But I will tell you, and Thomas Sowell, who's a black fellow at Harvard, at the Hoover Institute, will tell you that in terms of out-of-wedlock births, they were better than whites back then. In terms of unemployment rate, they were better than whites. In terms of two-parent households, they were, I don't know if they're better than whites, but they weren't any worse. And now all that stuff's gone to hell in a handbasket. And it's not because of the Jim Crow ending that should have happened. It's because of the Black Power starting and the victimhood starting and the affirmative action starting and the reparations talk starting. All that stuff has damaged the black family tremendously.
Yeah, the statutory discrimination and the cultural discrimination of those times was bad and needed to be gotten rid of. But in doing so, there may perhaps an overcorrection, overreaction that was sort of unchecked about how to react to this stuff, and how to talk to white people, how to talk to each other.
Well,
and
they fixed it by mandating that it be fixed, alternatively to just sort of ending the nonsense and letting it fix itself eventually. I think if we hadn't had the civil rights movement, I don't think in 2017 we would still be having separate
TV and the internet. I think.
Yeah, I think television.
It would have taken a lot longer.
Which is bad. But I mean, wait
a minute.
Okay,
I lived through this. I was born in '46, so in the '50s I was in elementary school. '60s I was in high school. What happened? The civil rights era cleaned out the laws that said schools were segregated and laundromats and restrooms were segregated and all that stuff, and discrimination against blacks in employment, including in the government. The Civil Rights thing, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, took care of most of that, and there was some mopping up. What happened is they started putting blacks on TV shows. Bill Cosby was the first black to star in he was a co-star of a private detective show with Robert Culp. There was a woman whose name escapes me now. She starred in a show called Julia. She was like a secretary, and she was black, and she was the star of the show. So you had a black secretary show about her, and she was successful, and she was a star. And then you had Bill Cosby co-starring with Robert Culp in a show. It wasn't about blacks. It was about private detectives, and they were a pair of private detectives, and it was a successful show. And then you got
after the civil rights movement.
Yes, yeah. Then you got in the '70s. You got this TV show by Norman Lear called All in the Family, where Archie Bunker was the main character, and he was this classic bigot not from the baby boomer generation, but from the guys that were in the big one, World War II, the greatest generation. So those guys were bigots.
The golden age of racism.
They were bigots. And partly they were bigots, and this is the whole TV thing. They were bigots about blacks and Polacks and kikes and all this stuff because they didn't know any. And then what happened is TV started putting them on the TV in their living room, and they got to know Bill Cosby, not as a black guy, but as Bill Cosby. And they got to know the actress who played Julia as...
Doesn't really work now anymore with Bill Cosby. He's... Kind of a bad guy.
He had phenomenal success. He had phenomenal success later with his own show called The Cosby Show.
The Huxtables.
Yeah, The Huxtables, which was a great show, and it created a tremendous number of spin-offs. Archie Bunker had spin-offs like The Jeffersons.
Well, but back to Archie Bunker, you had told me before that he was a bigot on the show, and it was not celebrated. It was to be laughed at.
It was mocked. Yeah, it was mocked. The show, the reason, and it was like the most popular.
This is from the 70s.
70s. It was the most popular show on television. Restaurants were complaining, and movie theaters, they couldn't sell movie tickets on Saturday night, and they couldn't sell restaurant meals because people staying home. You didn't have DVDs back then or DVRs, so people were staying home to watch it. Plus, it was a lineup of 3 shows. One was the Mary Tyler Moore Show. One was the Bob Newhart show, and one was All in the Family.
Great show.
So people stay home to watch those 3 shows. They were extremely popular. But the story of the Archie Bunker show, All in the Family, was that he had all these stupid old-time biases, early 20th century, mid-20th century biases, using the N-word and all that stuff. And the rest of the family made fun of him. Not his wife. His wife was kind of... She was kind of good-hearted, but
I can just picture her. Oh, Archie.
Yeah, she wouldn't make fun of him, and she wasn't. She wasn't politically correct. She was just nice. Yeah. She wouldn't use those words because they weren't nice. But you had Meathead, the son-in-law, and little girl. I forget her name.
Is that his actual name, or more of a
No, they
nickname?
called him Meathead. His name was Michael Stivic in the show, and I forget the first name of the daughter.
Meathead's better.
But they had the daughter.
Yeah.
But anyway, Stivic, who's this wise ass college kid, and he's so enlightened and liberal, and his wife, the daughter of Archie, followed his lead, and they were always making fun of Archie. And I remember.
So rather than like performing an intervention for his bigotry, they just sort of.
Oh, it was an ongoing intervention.
and having it at being
Well,
outraged
they were
and
laughing.
offended.
They were laughing at it.
Well, the son-in-law, Michael Stivic, and his wife, they were constantly on Archie to knock that off and making fun of him. There were a number of funny scenes. I remember once Archie was talking about, well, the Jews, they often change their name, but they change their name when they come here so they can hide that they're Jews, but you can tell by their first name. You got Irving and Abe, and Edith said, I didn't know Lincoln was Jewish. So that was the kind of stuff that they did. And then they had a neighbor who was black, moved into the neighborhood, and that was good for a bunch of episodes. The black neighbor moved into this neighborhood in Queens, and he used to come. The black neighbor was the same age as Stivic, and he used to come over to go jogging together. And Archie said, "What do you need to go jogging with Michael Stivic for? Meathead. What do you need Meathead to go jogging for? Why can't you go jogging by yourself?" He said, "Mr. Bunker, if you were a black guy in this neighborhood wearing a hoodie and sweats, and you're out running through the neighborhood, do you think maybe that'd be a bad idea?" He says, "I get your point, Lionel." That was his name. If you're a black guy, you have to get a white guy to run with you. Otherwise, people think you just broke into somebody's car.
Oh, God.
But that was the kind of humor they did, and it worked. It just, I have my whole life been behind closed doors with white people. And before the Archie Bunker show, a lot of them talked like Archie. And they had the stereotypes and all that, not only of the blacks, but the Poles and so forth. After that show, behind closed doors with white people,
Well, that's
that stuff's gone.
If I've got my history right, that was basically what took down the KKK. People infiltrated it, and
Well, the
and then
FBI.
they started putting out radio shows.
Well, rather than denouncing it, they put out the shows talking about the Grand Dragons and
they
the
put out
Kleagles.
They did a
and
radio show
all this
that was
goofy, like...
Yeah, they just spoofed it.
Yeah, I don't remember that. The FBI hit them pretty hard.
Well, they spoofed the crap out of it, and
But
it made all the
They use their real terminology.
Yeah.
They have all these ridiculous...
yeah, the Grand Cyclops, and they just made fun of the
ridiculous.
KKK, and it just kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller as they just got endlessly mocked for the nonsense that is blatant, hard and fast racism.
But somebody once said all movements go too far. The civil rights movement was correct. Their goal was correct. Their goal was colorblindness, by the way. You go back and look at the iconic moment of that era, which is the Martin Luther King "I Have a Dream" speech. You read that dream speech was about colorblindness. No affirmative action, no minority set-asides, no black power, none of that stuff. Colorblindness. And he also, listened to the way he talks. He had a PhD, and he tried to speak the King's English. And the teachers and the grown-ups back then tried to speak the King's English and teach their kid to speak the King's English as opposed to the Ebonics and all the stuff we got going now. But it was so
that's new, right? In
What?
the 50s, nobody talked the way...
No.
No, they were.
That's from
There
Redneck.
were. You had the Uncle Remus.
That way of talking comes from redneck England.
Well, and also
Thomas Sowell went and looked through it. It's like using saying axe instead of ask. There's redneck farmers in England.
Well, and also, that I didn't know about, but the uncle
brought it back. I mean,
Well,
what-
no,
those people moved to the south. They were more likely to move to the south. Certain areas of England moved to certain areas of the north.
Well, the blacks in the Uncle Remus movie that Disney made, Song of the South, and then you had Amos and Andy shows and all the blacks had a shtick talking a certain way, and the parents and the teachers of the black children trying to get them to stop talking that way. There was a character in the Amos and Andy radio show and TV show called the Kingfish. And he's always going, oh, almost like a vaudeville act when he's having a conversation.
Well, Airplane has the two guys.
Yeah, the crows.
And the old white lady says, "Excuse me, I speak jive."
You're not
And-
you're not talking about. I thought you were talking about the Dumbo movie. Yeah,
No, Airplane.
yeah.
Dumbo Airplane.
That was the woman from Leave It to Beaver's mom.
Oh, was it?
Yeah. But anyway, what happened in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s is the civil rights movement shamed America into passing laws, notably the Civil Rights Act of '64, which required Republicans to vote for it because the Democrats were against it. The South was run by Democrats then. Lyndon Johnson, the Democrat, was the president who got that through. You had that. You had the mopping up court decisions and the mopping up additional statutes, and then the Archie Bunker
and dealing with the sort of people trying to hide their racism, like with the disparate impact.
Well, no, that's
laws.
later. That's later. The Archie Bunker thing put the wooden the wooden dagger in the heart of racism generally. Then what happened is the people who did the civil rights movement wanted to keep doing it.
Right.
So they had to invent stuff. They had to bitch about
You have
what
to come
happened.
up with more and more trivial things to
or old,
object to.
or out of date. They want to argue about Tuskegee, where a bunch of black guys that had venereal disease were not treated as an experiment, but they weren't told it was an experiment, and that was an outrage.
Yeah.
But that's in the early '50s. So what the civil rights movement wants to do now, or the Black Power movement, or Black Lives Matter, or whatever, is they want to talk about stuff that happened 150 years ago, slavery and 5/8 of a citizen and all that. They want to talk about Tuskegee. They want to talk about the Army being segregated in
3/5.
World War II. They want to talk about old stuff that's over.
I could 5/8.
3/5, whatever.
3/5. That I
3/5
I could do a
compromise.
whole segment on the 3/5 thing. There's a lot of misconceptions about that. But go ahead.
But anyway, that stuff was bad and should have been gotten rid of, and it was gotten rid of. Since then, you have the Black Power movement. You have Black is Beautiful. You have Black Lives Matter. You have affirmative action. You have minority set-asides. You got reparations, and all this stuff. It was the movement going too far. The movement was right. The Civil Rights Act of '64 was right. But now they get the microscope out. They're bitching over trivia.
Well,
they lie, like the hands up, don't shoot.
You said movements go too far. I was trying to explain this to a friend, but it's like if you picture it like a car. You tell the truth, the movement's going to move at 30 miles per hour towards its goal. If you lie, it might be more like 40 miles per hour. So the lie has this sort of moral justification in their mind that we need to get to this goal
The ends justify
by
the
any
means.
means necessary.
Well-
and there's a strong incentive for the movement to fib, lie, whatever you want to call it.
Well, and people just they refuse to.
The means.
Hey,
and
we
ends
won.
justify the means.
Hey, we won. Pack up, go home.
But they don't want to go home.
Well, that's the other part of it. They're social justice warriors.
Yeah.
They don't want the war to end. They want to.
When I was a kid, they invented the
so
polio vaccine.
They convinced themselves the war isn't over.
Yeah.
Even
never
when,
over.
Even when it,
That's their job.
It's never over.
Polio vaccine. When I was a kid, they had the March of Dimes. The March of Dimes wanted you to contribute dimes, which were worth money back then. They were made of silver, for one thing.
We're worth money.
They were. You could buy stuff with a dime.
Now they're the dandruff of the
two-
American economy.
You could buy 2 candy bars with a dime back then, or you could get a Coke for a dime. But anyway, the
I
March
can't
of
make a
Dimes.
phone call for a dime.
The March, that's right. Well, it used to be a phone call cost a
Yeah,
dime.
I
It
know.
used to be a cup of coffee cost a dime. But anyway, the March of Dimes wanted you to give dimes, and they had all these little books, and you would put them in like coin collection, and it was filled. You would turn it into the March of Dimes. So they wanted to cure polio. And then Dr. Jonas Salk, when I was a kid, I must have been in 3rd or 4th grade, maybe 5th. Dr. Jonas Salk discovers the polio vaccine. And so we all got it. Your Uncle Art.
And
who
polio hath been cured.
Yeah, pretty much. Your Uncle Art had polio when he was 12 years old back then. Right, he got polio after the vaccine was invented. That's another story. But anyway,
Do we still vaccinate for polio?
I don't know if they vaccinate or they killed it so much that they don't have to vaccinate. I don't know which they do. But anyway, the polio vaccine was discovered. And you would think over at the March of Dimes, they'd be going, yay, we did it! Doing victory laps
victory.
and all. I think they all looked at each other and said, oh, shit, we just got fired. So there's still a March of Dimes, right? And what are they about now? Birth defects. You notice this time around, they didn't pick no single disease and some sucker come in with a vaccine and blow them off the face of the earth.
Heart disease.
Well,
I think there's
dishonesty
Heart
in
disease,
the name
the
of
thing that everyone dies
self-preservation.
of eventually.
Yeah.
Well, not really. Art didn't die of that.
Well, no, but I'm saying if you live long enough.
Yeah, something that'll
just-
get
Well,
you.
I know you guys-
When I hear someone died of heart disease, they're 80, 90.
Well,
they didn't wreck their bike at Harley Week.
the,
They got old.
The civil rights people, the left, the liberals, they're like the March of Dimes people. They got the civil rights, like Shelby Steele said. He's a black guy.
Well,
also at
they're
the
not
Hoover
even willing to
Institute.
take a reduced role. It's like, hey, all right, so we can scale back this operation because now we're going after smaller and smaller targets in terms of racism. No,
Well,
it gets bigger and bigger and
Shelby
bigger.
Steele,
As the offenses get smaller and smaller and smaller.
Shelby Steele is a fellow at the Hoover Institute, like Thomas Sowell, and he said the civil rights struggle is over. We won. Well, the civil rights warriors don't want it to be over. So now they're doing all this microscopic.
Especially the ones getting paid to fight. In this
it's an
phantom
industry.
war.
It is an industry. There are organizations, the NAACP, which stands for the National Association of Colored People, but
National Association for the Advancement
of Colored People. Yeah, and then there's the Negro College Fund, and but some of them have the old names still, but Shelby Steele is correct.
Yeah, shouldn't it be NAAPOC now? You have to say
PC.
people of color.
Yeah.
Can't, you
Anyway,
have to go with the French derivation.
Steele is correct. Steele is correct. They won, but they didn't want to win. And also, Thomas Sowell.
They want to keep winning.
Thomas Sowell uses this phrase of what a lot of them apparently wanted. We now know they didn't want to end racism. They wanted to put it under new management. So now we have racism under the management of blacks and liberals, and the affirmative action and all that stuff.
Yeah, it has this. As the grievances get more and more trivial, I seem to notice the academics. It's almost like they're better detectives. They're finding these really hidden, nuanced things. Whereas before, people would just, some store owner would, say the N-word out loud and nobody would care. Now it's, I found it deeply hidden in here after I searched the caves.
Dog whistle.
After I searched the caves of Machu Picchu.
And they pride themselves on ending people's careers.
Yeah.
Well, that's the collecting scalps, right?
Yeah. So anyway,
figuratively speaking.
Have we been sufficiently provocative?
Well, it seems.
I think so.
Okay.
What is a hot take?
Oh, my hot take that would piss people off and get me fired if I said it. The correct way to respond to racist comments is what white people do when racist comments get thrown our way. You know how many racist slurs there are for white people? Dozens. White people don't care.
Yeah.
Oh, you call me a cracker? Okay.
A lot don't.
You call me a pan blanc? Yeah, some do.
I
laugh at them.
I get annoyed when somebody starts a lecture off with "Listen, white guy," I won't just laugh, ha ha ha. I will point out the hypocrisy of it. It's like you can't start off a lecture about racism by referring to my race.
Yeah, my point is,
moron.
If some moron is going around using racial slurs, whatever.
Be laughed at like Archie Bunker.
It's a word. You should be laughed at.
The social justice movement, their attitude is if we allow any of this, it will come back, like you said earlier. Well, it's like no, everyone's going to laugh at that person.
Well, it's like what are your options here when someone uses a racial slur? One, you don't do anything, you ignore it, or you cow to it. Alternative two, you get super pissed and outraged and call for their being fired. Or option three, which is, okay, that was really kind of stupid. What decade are you living in?
Well,
is to mock them.
Everyone's
going with outrage now.
People learn when they're in elementary school that you're going to get teased, and if you react big, you're going to get teased more. And you have certain groups, like Jews have used to have anyway, the Jewish Anti-Defamation League, and there are also some organizations like that. Same kind of idea for maybe Poles and Italians, Italian American Anti-Defamation League or something. If your group has an Anti-Defamation League, you need to disband it and focus on other things. Not that you don't have causes, but remember recently there was a bunch of Jewish cemeteries were being attacked, and somebody's writing swastikas. And all the Holocaust is back and anti-Semitism. No, it was one black guy, PO'd at his girlfriend who broke up with him, trying to get her in trouble. And I used to say when, if kids, regular kids, go break a window in a church, nobody pays any attention. if they go to the synagogue and put a swastika on it, it's on the freaking
Right.
evening news.
Oh, it's the same.
So
yeah, no.
they may not know how to spell swastika.
Yeah, Milo talked about it on the Rubin Report, which is an online interview show, and he basically said there's all these kids sometimes referred to as the alt-right. They're thought of as this white nationalist movement online. And Milo said, there are Nazis out there. There are people who think whites are superior. But the majority of these kids, they're just kids that are trying to get a rise out of you.
Right.
They'll
exactly.
send a tweet to some famous person, and basically they pick the stuff that gets people the angriest. Like you said, if you go to the synagogue and put a swastika, they're not anti-Jewish. They just know that saying
publicity.
Yeah, saying Nazi slurs or Jewish slurs and pro-Nazi stuff gets the biggest rise out of people.
Yeah, it'll be on the
so
evening
that's why
news.
they do it.
Yeah.
And it has nothing to do with actual anti-Semitism.
Exactly. And the reason there isn't really an established racist term for white people is because you don't get a rise out of anyone.
Well,
someone says the
that's
N-word.
part of it.
We
yeah.
are
Someone
the
says the N-word,
majority.
the
We're also
universe explodes.
we're also the majority.
We're the majority. I wonder, I don't know, but I wonder if in Africa they have true slurs for whites.
Well,
I
in
think-
Mexico, they're gringo.
Well, and
there's a couple others.
And in
Is it-
Japan, they have the word
you got,
gaijin.
you got guaylo.
Gaijin means foreigner, but in Japanese, foreigner is a bad thing. They have hardly any immigration there.
Right.
So certainly in the Far East, where I was in the Vietnam War, and I was also in Hong Kong during the war, I felt the racism. They were as a matter of fact, I always thought the North Vietnamese were fighting as hard as they did for racist reasons, not communism versus capitalism. But anyway, I don't know I think in Africa they have words for whites that relate to colonial era.
White devil.
Yeah, well, the white, the white overseers, the white bosses. They were because the whites in Africa originally in the colonial
I think
era
people
were
instinctively
like,
laugh at that one.
plantation
White
owners.
devil.
Which is why it hasn't stuck around.
Well,
the only guy that still says
here's-
shit like that is Farrakhan.
Yeah. Well, here's my hypothetical question: if just overnight, someone says the N-word and nobody reacts,
Just stop saying it.
It would go away.
it would vanish off
Right.
off the planet. It would go away because it doesn't have any shock value anymore.
Right. Well, that's like the little kid in the playground
well, so-
yard.
I was trying to
learning
think.
not
I was trying to think of
overreact.
examples of that. I remember as a kid, there were a lot of Polish jokes, and it was basically making fun of how dumb Polish people are.
They're very
Have you? When's the last
smart.
time? Well, no. I one of my best friends in college, and it was a good college. But my point is that used to be the dumb joke. Was the Polak joke? Nobody makes Polak jokes anymore. It just went away. Why? Is it because of the Polak Anti-Defamation League fought the war?
I think there was a period.
And won.
I think there was a period when Polish people immigrated to the United States, and there was like a Pole town in Detroit, and there was Polak town in
Yeah,
Camden.
they didn't speak enough English or any.
Well, they were different. They're all blonde
Different
and
culture.
blue-eyed, and they have these funny names, Kowalski and all that. But I think they just dispersed into the suburbs, and that's why it ended. Plus, people nowadays wouldn't know why are you making fun of Polish people? Why not Estonians or
right? Yeah,
Belgians?
no. Well, and the same with
Italian. They used to have a lot of Italian jokes too.
we discussed that last week about the Japanese. Immigrated to multiple countries, two being the U.S. and Brazil, and World War II happened, and the U.S. interned Japanese during
Put them in concentration camps.
put them in camps, and
They weren't tortured or anything. They just put in camps.
right, they had their property taken from them,
Right.
and stuff like that. And the observation Sol made is that even after that happened, Japanese Americans felt loyal to America. They felt like Americans, and Brazilian Japanese who were never interned
During the war. During
always
World War II.
still identified as from Japan. They were just in Brazil. And he said the reason is because those two groups of Japanese were different before they ever left Japan. And
from different parts of
they
Japan.
were from different parts of Japan, and they're but the point being is the Japanese Americans they didn't lead a political movement after that to prevent internments and hold rallies, and they didn't have a ton of mainstream political figures. I think another quote from Sol is name three Japanese American political figures.
Well, Sesshu Hayakawa, who was a senator and the head of San Francisco State, And then there was a guy,
But what's the name recognition
recent,
of that person?
Well, but it was big time back then when he was a senator.
But you do word association with his name, and you say senator.
Back when he was a senator, and before that, he was famous. And then there was a guy who'd been wounded in Italy in World War II. He was a long-time senator from Hawaii.
Yeah, but are these two are they thought of as civil rights leaders who got Japanese Americans their rights back and helped make them prosperous via political means?
Sesshu Hayakawa was famous for standing up to the college kids trying to take over the college back in the 60s.
Okay.
That had nothing to do with him being Japanese.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
The guy from Hawaii, who fought in Italy in World War II, he was in the famous Japanese American unit, the 442nd Infantry or something. They got a zillion medals. They took some of the Japanese. The Japanese in the internment camp said, "Hey, we'd like to fight in the war," and they said, "Oh, okay." So they made an all Japanese unit. It was sent to Europe. I think they should have sent the ones that could speak Japanese to the Pacific. They did use some of them there.
Probably smart. If you're already interning them, you obviously believe there's an issue. So yes.
Well, the Hawaii senator,
whether they're right or wrong,
he was one of the wounded heroes of that unit, mm-hmm. and that unit was a kind of a civil rights thing where the Japanese wanted to show that they're Americans too, and that they can fight, and they were very decorated. It was somewhat similar to, and in the same area as the Tuskegee Airmen, which was a black pilots group. They flew fighter planes.
But it's the interesting thing that they sort of adopted America. They didn't think of themselves as Japanese anymore. I mean, they're still
the melting pot,
but they embraced the melting pot, so to speak.
Right, and so did my grandfather was.
And other groups come here, and not just here, but other countries, and they never their culture doesn't change.
Well, it's not. That's a recent phenomenon. It used to be all the people who immigrated here assimilated. The first generation, they have all these goofy first names.
You still
get
to be Irish.
The second generation, the first kid might have one of these goofy foreign names. But then the second one is Joe, and the third one is Bob, and then the third generation they live in this. Actually, the Bob and Joe generation, they moved to the suburbs.
What?
The other people are in the downtown area where it's all the same cultural people.
You still get to be Irish. You still get to be Japanese. You still get to be Russian, but you need to be American first. Is sort of the idea behind the melting pot.
Culturally, I don't think Japanese born here.
Well, you can't be. I'm going to be an Irish person who lives in America, but I'm not. I'm going to consider myself an Irishman.
Well, I think Americans today, Japanese Americans who were born here, Irish Americans who were born here,
which is us.
They consider the prefix, the word before the hyphen, to be a kind of an odd footnote to who they are. But the Japanese Americans here, we're here in California, Northern California. We have a zillion Japanese and Vietnamese and Chinese and so forth. And the vast majority of them, I mean, they may go celebrate Chinese New Year, but I don't get the impression they're doing Chinese stuff on a daily basis. But now the Muslims in Detroit and all that, the Somalis and all, they seem to be hanging on pretty tight to that stuff. Not all of them, but a lot of them. So that's what's, and then in Europe.
Well, self-segregating, keeping themselves separate from the rest of the
population.
There's Chinatown.
There's always been Chinatown. There's been Chinatown for 150 years.
But it's not like this separate area.
Chinatown tends to be the older generation and the new arrivals, and the regular Chinese Americans who were born here, they moved to the suburbs like we did. So it's a... The Muslims in Europe and the Muslims here, a lot of them have been resistant to assimilation. And that is not acceptable. I don't know what law they can pass about it. But even Angela Merkel...
Was it Germany? Yeah, Germany that said multiculturalism is not a thing. It doesn't work.
Angela Merkel said the Americans did this right. And you have to understand how few times the people in Europe say the Americans did something right. They think we're cultural inferiors. But they said that we did it right and with the assimilation. But it was not conscious. Assimilation in the United States, there was no assimilation policy.
Right.
It was just, that's the deal. And it was everybody just accepted it. And you couldn't, it used to be...
Well, you had a whole generation of people who they left their home, came here, and had to get by on their own. There wasn't
No, they would.
There was
band
no
together.
infrastructure.
No,
but then those people had kids, and then
they would band together. Like the Poles would arrive, and they would go to Pole Town.
Well, they could communicate with those people, learn.
Well, they had
learn American
Polish food.
things from someone who could speak.
Well, Polish food, but then a lot of the European people, they would come and they would pee in a chamber pot at night, and they'd dump it out the window in the morning. and the Poles or Italians or whoever had been here longer said, "Hey, you're not in Warsaw anymore. We don't do that here." So and then they went to school. School was in English. Now that's the way it is in California, but other states they have this bilingual education crap, which delays when you just say we speak English.
Rip
in
the Band-Aid off.
In California, they said, "Hey, we speak English in the schools." That was a referendum that passed, and the liberals are all going nuts about it, and it passed, and they found that kids did better.
Yeah.
It was kind of like a total immersion language course, but that's the way it was done without any thought back when I was a kid. The immigrants came, they banded together. Maybe their older brother was already in America and he had a job, and they would get off the boat. They would go to where he was, and they would stay there for a while. He'd help them get a job. Bada bing, bada boom. 20, 30 years later, their kid's named Sean, and he's playing Little League and all that
Spelled
stuff.
Scene.
What?
C-A-N. Your favorite spelling of Sean?
Well, there was no such thing as Sean when I was a kid. That's all comes from Sean Connery.
Sean.
As do many names. But yeah, the reaction to all this is the affirmative action, preferential policies, and basically and coming back to the Google thing is they have these programs, mentoring and classes only for people of a certain gender or race, and one of the things this guy is arguing is that is discrimination. Yeah. That is clear cut as it can be.
Sometimes called reverse discrimination, but that's a superfluous word. It's just racism.
In my mind, reverse discrimination is worse than the original discrimination in the sense that the reverse discriminators know better.
You're doing it intentionally, yeah.
Yeah, the original discrimination
that
should have known better, but they didn't.
That which you denounced, you are now doing.
Right.
You denounced it up one side, down the other, and now it's racism under new management.
Right.
Instead of colorblindness or an end of racism.
And it's looking at people in terms of groups, but applying policies that affect individuals. So you might say, okay, only 20% of white people need this mentoring, but 60% of black people need the mentoring. So we're going to have a mentoring program only for black people. It's like, well, the 60% are the same as the 20%. They both need the mentoring. So you're going to not allow those 20% in because they're white. And it's just as clear-cut discrimination as it gets. But because people think we need to even these numbers out. It's not about helping people necessarily, although there will be people helped by it. It's about making all these numbers equal, 50-50 or whatever the, 65-13, whatever the population breakdown is.
We have to end with one recent development, which I'm very glad to see. A whole bunch of Asian groups have sued Harvard and other Ivy League schools.
Oh, the SAT
for discrimination against Asians. Obviously, there is a quota on Asians in these schools, and the consequence of the quota, since the Asians perform very well academically, a lot of them. And on the SAT score, the upshot of the quota is that you got to get an Asian person has to get 450 points higher than a black on the SAT to get into Harvard. Right. And it's all the way down to the whites. They have to do a smaller number better than whites and a medium number better than Hispanics.
They get like a 50. At least one of the schools. This was the point system I heard described was Asians got like a 50-point penalty.
For being Asian.
And black people were given 200 plus point bonus
for being black.
And then they start their evaluation.
But the Harvard swears it's not a quota system. They're lying.
Right.
Now, I'm a Harvard graduate. They are lying. Now, when I went to Harvard, interestingly, I think they might have had affirmative action in admissions at my school. I went to Harvard Business School. We had in my 85-person section, initially, we had about 8 or 10 blacks. At the end of the year, the first year, they flunk out the bottom 10%. It's
based on
That's
grades.
a rule.
Yeah,
that's a rule. Because they don't want you slacking off after you get admitted. So the bottom 10%, I think it was the bottom 10%, and I don't know if it's still true. The bottom 10%, they ranked the 85 people in the section. The bottom 8.5 people are gone. And in my class, all the blacks and one of the Hispanics, we had 2 Hispanics, all the blacks and one of the Hispanics, they're out of here. So I don't know whether they had affirmative action in admissions, but not in professors. These are tenured professors, most of them.
Yeah, once they got there, the policy wasn't applied.
That's what it looks like. That's only one section. I don't know how it went across the thing.
A couple of economists harp on this stuff. Is affirmative action does not help because it mismatches students with colleges.
Well, they're not prepared for the school they get into.
It would be like taking, deciding, what, this high school kid needs to be better at baseball. I'm going to put him on the Yankees, and this will make him better. No, he's going to get destroyed.
Yeah, kill his self-confidence. He'll be
if he lasts long enough.
He's liable to commit suicide.
Right. Yeah.
All of which happens to black college kids in the elite schools.
Well, it happens with kids of every race being mismatched. I had a couple teammates who got in. What's that?
Where?
At Columbia. Couple teammates.
Football teammates.
Yeah, they were the ones I'm talking about are white, and they could not keep up with the classwork, and they got in because they were good at football, and they weren't the high band, really high score kids, but they had enough to qualify, and they were good enough to play football, so they got in. Some of those guys survived. Most did not. They failed. They flunked out. I had one teammate across the hall. He just checked out the last semester. He played video games all day. He wasn't even trying.
He knew he was done.
Yeah, he was done. And I suspect he was mismatched with the college. It was too advanced for him for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And that's just a mismatch regardless of your race. If your high school, your junior high did not prepare you academically for whatever reason, sending you to an elite college is not going to make you elite.
I mean, some people.
It could.
Some people, this guy.
It's unlikely.
Guy in my West Point class who was black and who had to go to the black segregated high school in the larger city. He ended up graduating. My class only had 9 blacks graduate out of 706.
706 people in the class.
Yeah, graduating. We had 1,000 when we started, and there were more blacks when we started. But there were only 9 black guys in my class that graduated when I counted them in the yearbook. He got a PhD from, wait for it, Columbia University in international relations. Mm-hmm. And his daughter, I think his 2 daughters went to Yale. So now this is a black kid from my little farm town where he was a descendant of the slaves who were slaves in
Forced
that
to
town.
Go to a segregated high school.
He couldn't go to the high school of the descendants of the slave owners.
Right.
So he ends up with himself getting an Ivy League PhD, not a master's, a PhD, and his 2 daughters go to Yale. So it might be that him going to West Point, and I don't know how good his high school was, him going to West Point helped him. Maybe it was a struggle. Of course, it was a struggle for all of us. The place was very hard.
I don't think you're going to find too many people who will be like, yeah, that West Point was super easy.
Yeah, whew, breeze.
Well, some of the really smart guys, it must have been easy for them academically, but it wasn't easy for anybody overall.
Some guy named Steve Rogers went to West Point, said this was easy.
Yeah, Steve Rogers.
It's Captain America.
Yeah,
it's a bad joke.
Oh.
Well.
Anyway, I think probably some. Who's the doctor that ran for president? Ben Carson. Ben Carson. When his mom couldn't read, you guys saw the movie about his life.
Yeah.
But she was a maid, and she worked in a lot of different rich people's houses, and she figured out she's in these houses and there's all these books.
Right.
And then she cleaned other people's houses that weren't so rich. They didn't. She saw a correlation between how many books there were in the house and how rich they were.
Yeah, she was militant about making him read, despite her inability to do so.
And he didn't know she couldn't read, but she made them read a book every week, and they had to give a book report to her. And,
wow.
But she didn't know how to read. But
John Reedish.
She kept quiet.
He did it with math, not reading.
She kept quiet that she never told them she couldn't read. He figured it out finally. And then he went to medical school, Or did he go to Yale or something for undergrad? I think he did.
I don't know.
There was talk. He said he was offered a scholarship at West Point, and he really wasn't. He was just encouraged to apply. But anyway, he went to medical school, and he almost flunked out. He finally figured out that the classes were not helping him, and they were taking up his time. So he would study the books real hard, and that's how he managed to survive medical school. And then when I was at West Point, I almost flunked out from falling asleep because they told us you have to do all the homework. So I was going to bed at like 1 in the morning and getting up at 6, and it wasn't enough sleep. And my grades started to suffer from that. So I finally decided I'm going to bed at 10. I get up at 5. If I flunk out because I didn't spend enough time on the homework, so be it. But I'm not flunking out for lack of sleep. So I that turned it around for me. But so I think maybe you give a poor kid who doesn't have very good preparation admission to an Ivy League school. If he responds correctly, it could be good for him. But I think in general, what you said and what Thomas Sowell said is correct. They're overwhelmed.
Yeah, you take 100 kids that were not prepared academically for a really hard school. Some of them might succeed, but the majority probably will not. And it has nothing to do with them. It's that they weren't prepared.
They weren't prepared.
Columbia was really, really hard, and there were some classes that it was obviously going at a pace it couldn't keep up with. And you find ways to get through it. But I think another thing from Sowell is he said, I think when he was at Cornell, or he said at MIT, the black students there are in the top 10% of the country for academic performance, but they're in the bottom 10% at MIT because everyone else at MIT is in the top 1%.
Yeah.
And the professors pitch the curriculum at the 1%, the 99th percentile, and if you're at the 90th, that's too fast.
Yeah,
you got to do extra work. You got to study longer to survive that, and maybe get yourself up to the 99th percentile in less than a year.
But you'd
which
have done
is a
better.
hell of a task.
You'd have done better at San Jose State.
Well, what he says is what happens is they would have done better at San Jose State, where they could get the same engineering degree they might get at MIT. What they end up doing is they either drop out of college altogether, or they switch to some easy soft major. So they become a blank studies major at MIT when they could have been a chemical engineer at San Jose State.
Yeah.
So the affirmative action policies have a negative effect by mismatching the kids.
I'll tell you what else I've heard about affirmative action is the kids have slacked off. In my day, when I was a kid, the black parents told the black kids, "You got to work twice as hard."
Slack off where? You mean?
And academically, they don't have to get. The white kids, the tiger moms, the Asian daughters are busting their asses to get all A's and take AP courses. And the black kids who want to go to the same college saying, "I don't have to do that," and they don't. And there
might be an element of that, yeah.
So yeah, no, I've heard.
There's absolutely some of it. It's just I don't think it's super widespread.
No, I heard it was widespread.
Well, is that now? I wouldn't have said that for nowadays. I would accept the premise that it maybe occurred a lot in previous decades.
I think
maybe it's still the case.
I think it's current.
Well, I think part of the problem is all this rhetoric about you can't succeed because the white devil, the white man will keep you down,
I'm not talking
and that
about that.
creates a little bit of apathy as well.
I'm talking about because you're black, if you do decently, you'll get in to the.
Well, that's the SAT numbers. I mean,
maybe
we have evidence. Colleges are giving you bonus points because of the color of your skin, and taking them away for certain colors.
All right, let's wrap it up. That's more than enough, and we'll see you next time.